People only notice hunger when it embarrasses them. I learned that when I was 12 years old and caught wrapping leftover dinner rolls in napkins at a country club banquet my mother cleaned after midnight. 10 years later, not much had changed. The Moretti mansion smelled like rosemary butter and expensive wine long after the guests had gone home. Crystal glasses still glittered beneath the chandelier reflections while the staff rushed through cleanup before sunrise. I waited until the kitchen emptied before stepping out from behind the pantry door. My stomach cramped so hard it made me dizzy. I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Tuition payments were due in 3 days, Mom's heart medication had doubled in price again, and the diner near campus had cut my hours last week. Hunger had become something I carried quietly, like another organ inside my body. The industrial kitchen looked unreal at 2 a.m. marble countertops polished to perfection. Copper pots hanging above the island. Trays of untouched filet mignon and roasted vegetables lined beside silver serving platters worth more than my entire semester tuition. I hated how badly I wanted the food. Hated the weakness of it. But hunger always wins eventually. My hands trembled as I opened the trash compartment beneath the prep station. Most of the food had barely been touched. Rich people threw away meals that could feed entire families for days. I swallowed hard and spotted a steak resting on top of the waste liner, untouched except for one missing bite. Still warm. My throat tightened with shame as I reached for it. Are you that hungry, or has someone been starving you? The voice behind me nearly stopped my heart. I spun so fast I slammed my hip against the counter. The steak slipped from my fingers onto the polished floor. For one horrible second, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then I saw him standing near the kitchen entrance. Vincent Moretti. Even if I hadn't recognized the face from newspapers and whispered staff conversations, the room itself would have told me who he was. Power changed the air around certain people. Tall. Dark suit. Black tie loosened slightly beneath the collar of a crisp white shirt. His sleeves were rolled back just enough to reveal a silver watch that probably cost more than my mother earned in a year. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his coat like he'd just come in from the storm outside. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. Cold gray. Sharp enough to cut through every lie I almost tried to say. I'm sorry, I blurted immediately, crouching to grab the fallen steak before it stained the floor. Please don't fire my mother. She didn't know I was here. My voice cracked on the last word. Humiliating. Vincent didn't answer right away. His gaze moved slowly over me instead. The oversized sweater with frayed sleeves. The cheap sneakers splitting near the soles. The way my fingers shook from exhaustion as I clutched food pulled from a garbage bin. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. Look at me, he said quietly. I obeyed before I could stop myself. Men like Vincent Moretti weren't used to repeating commands. His expression didn't change, but something colder settled into his features the longer he looked at me. Not disgust. Worse. Anger. What's your name? Emily Carter. Margaret Carter's daughter? I nodded carefully. My mother had worked in this mansion for 16 years. Long enough to become invisible to the wealthy people living inside it. Vincent's eyes dropped briefly to the painkillers sticking halfway out of my coat pocket. Then to the fading burn mark near my wrist from the diner grill. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How long since you ate a real meal, Emily? The question hit harder than yelling ever could. Because nobody had asked me that before. Nobody important ever noticed people like me long enough to care. I looked down at the steak clenched in my hands and whispered the truth anyway. I don't remember. Vincent Moretti stared at me for so long that my skin started to burn beneath my sweater. The kitchen suddenly felt too quiet. Too bright. Somewhere upstairs, distant laughter echoed from guests still drinking after the fundraiser, completely unaware that the daughter of their maid was standing barefoot on cold marble holding food from a trash bin. I realized then that I had Forgotten to put my shoes back on after changing out of my diner uniform downstairs. My socks were damp from the kitchen floor. God, this was humiliating. Come here, Vincent said. Panic climbed straight into my throat. Please, I whispered quickly. I will leave right now. My mother cannot lose this job. He did not raise his voice. Somehow that made him more intimidating. I said, come here, Emily. My legs moved before my pride could stop them. I stepped closer carefully, still clutching the ruined steak in a napkin like evidence of a crime. Up close, Vincent smelled faintly of rain, cedar, and expensive cologne. The sharp scent of whiskey lingered beneath it. Not enough to seem careless. Just enough to remind me he had spent the evening around powerful men making powerful decisions. His gaze lowered briefly toward my hands. You burned yourself recently. I instinctively hid the mark near my wrist. It is nothing. That was not a question. His tone stayed calm. Controlled. But there was something underneath it now. Something heavy enough to make my pulse stumble. I swallowed hard. The grill at the diner. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly. You work 2 jobs. 3. The answer slipped out before I could stop it. Regret hit me immediately. Rich people never liked hearing about struggle up close. It ruined the atmosphere around them. But Vincent did not look annoyed. If anything, the silence around him darkened. And college, he asked. Community college in Brooklyn. How many hours do you sleep? I almost laughed at that. Instead I looked away toward the polished refrigerator doors because eye contact suddenly felt dangerous. Enough. That little. I hated how easily he saw through me. Vincent rested one hand against the marble counter beside him, studying me like he was piecing together something broken. Then his eyes stopped near my coat pocket again. What medication are you carrying? My stomach dropped. I stepped back instinctively. It is for my mother. What kind? Heart medication. The words came out smaller this time. Vincent's jaw tightened again. Insurance does not cover it. I shook my head once. Not enough. For a second neither of us spoke. The giant kitchen hummed softly around us with the sound of industrial refrigerators and distant rain tapping against the windows. I became painfully aware of every cheap thread in my clothes. Every exhausted breath leaving my body. Vincent finally looked toward the trash bin behind me. His expression changed in a way I could not fully understand. Colder somehow. But not toward me. How long has Margaret been employed here? 16 years. And you still need to eat leftovers in secret? Shame spread hot across my face. Please stop, I whispered. I know how this looks. Do you? His voice remained quiet. Because from where I am standing, it looks like someone in my house failed you. The sentence hit harder than I expected. Failed you. Not disgusted by you. Not embarrassed by you. Failed you. I opened my mouth but no words came out. Nobody had ever spoken about me like I mattered enough to fail. Vincent straightened slightly and reached into the inside pocket of his coat. My body tensed automatically. Instead of a phone or wallet, he pulled out a crisp white handkerchief and held it toward me. You are bleeding. I looked down in confusion. Tiny drops of blood stained my fingertips where I had cut myself grabbing the steak off the floor. I had not even noticed. Carefully, almost awkwardly, I accepted the handkerchief from him. The fabric felt softer than anything I owned. Thank you, I murmured. Vincent watched me wrap it around my hand. Then his gaze lifted toward the giant dining hall beyond the kitchen doors where hundreds of untouched desserts still sat beneath crystal chandeliers. His expression hardened completely. No one in this house, he said slowly, should ever be hungry. I barely slept after that conversation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vincent Moretti standing in the middle of that enormous kitchen looking at me like hunger itself offended him personally. By 6 in the morning, I was back downstairs helping my mother polish silver trays before the breakfast gathering upstairs. The mansion had transformed overnight. The glittering party atmosphere was gone, replaced by quiet efficiency and low conversations between men in dark suits carrying tablets and espresso cups through the hallways. My mother looked exhausted. Deep shadows sat beneath her eyes as she folded linen napkins with careful hands that trembled slightly from fatigue. "You should not be helping today," I whispered as I reached for another stack. "You barely slept." She forced a small smile. "Neither did you." I hesitated before speaking again. "Mom, how long have you been working double shifts here?" Her folding stopped for half a second. Too quick for anyone else to notice. Not too quick for me. "It is temporary." That meant yes. My chest tightened. "You promised the doctor you would slow down. And doctors promise many expensive things." She tried to laugh softly, but the sound came out thin. Weak. I hated hearing it. Before I could answer, the head housekeeper swept into the dining room wearing her usual sharp navy uniform and expression of permanent irritation. Diane Holloway ran the Moretti estate with the precision of a military officer and the warmth of a prison gate. Her eyes landed on me immediately. "Why is she still here?" she snapped toward my mother. "Breakfast guests arrive in 30 minutes, Margaret. This is not a shelter." Heat rushed into my face. I was helping. Then help somewhere invisible. Diane walked closer, lowering her voice just enough to make the insult feel more personal. "Mr. Moretti does not pay people to stand around looking pitiful in front of important guests." My mother stiffened beside me. "Please do not speak to my daughter that way." Diane's lips curved slightly. "Not a smile. Something meaner. Then perhaps your daughter should stop sneaking around kitchens at 2 in the morning eating scraps." My stomach dropped. My mother turned toward me in confusion and horror. "Emily, I can explain," I started quickly, but Diane cut me off with a cold laugh. "Actually, no explanation is necessary. We all know desperation when we see it." The room suddenly felt smaller. Harder to breathe inside. I opened my mouth again, but another voice spoke first. "Interesting." Every sound disappeared instantly. Diane straightened so fast she nearly dropped the clipboard in her hand. "Vincent." Moretti stood near the doorway in a charcoal suit with one hand resting loosely in his pocket. Two men in black jackets lingered several feet behind him, silent as shadows. But Vincent only looked at Diane. "Tell me something," he said calmly. "At what point exactly did humiliating my employees become part of your job description?" Diane's face drained of color. "Sir, I was only addressing inappropriate conduct." Vincent stepped farther into the room. Slow. Controlled. Dangerous in the quietest possible way. "You mean the conduct where a 23-year-old girl is hungry enough to eat discarded food inside my home?" Diane swallowed hard. "I did not realize." "No," Vincent interrupted softly. "You did not care enough to realize." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the kitchen staff froze beside the serving carts pretending not to stare. Vincent's gaze shifted toward my mother next. "How long has Margaret been working overtime without medical leave?" My mother looked stunned. Diane answered too quickly. "She volunteered for the additional shifts." Vincent's eyes cut back toward her instantly. "I was not asking you." The silence afterward felt enormous. My mother lowered her eyes carefully. "About 8 months, sir." Vincent looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "And during those 8 months, your daughter has been paying for your medication alone?" My heartbeat stumbled. How did he know that already? Diane looked genuinely confused now. Vincent did not even glance at her when he gave his next order. "Cancel the breakfast seating arrangement." The room went completely still. "Sir," Diane whispered. Vincent finally turned toward me. His expression softened just slightly when our eyes met. "Emily," he said quietly. "You are having breakfast with me this morning." The dining room looked like something pulled from an old movie about American royalty. Morning light spilled through 40-foot windows, turning the crystal chandeliers into rivers of gold across the marble floor. A table long enough to seat 20 people stretched beneath them, covered in white roses, silver coffee pots, and enough food to feed an entire neighborhood. Fresh croissants. Bacon. Eggs. Fruit arranged so perfectly it barely looked real. I had spent years serving rooms like this without ever imagining I would sit inside one. My hands would not stop shaking. "Emily," my mother whispered beside me near the doorway, panic flooding her face. "You cannot sit there." Honestly, I agreed with her. Every survival instinct I had developed growing up poor screamed that this was dangerous. People like me did not belong at tables like this. Especially not beside men like Vincent Moretti. But Vincent stood near the head chair waiting with one hand resting lightly against the back of it like he had already decided the argument was over. Around him, powerful men in tailored suits exchanged confused looks over their espresso cups. Nobody questioned him out loud. That terrified me more than yelling would have. Diane Holloway approached carefully. "Sir, perhaps it would be more appropriate if Miss Carter ate downstairs after service." Vincent did not even look at her. "Did I ask for your opinion?" The room fell silent again. I felt at least 20 pairs of eyes land on me at once. Heat crawled up my neck. I wanted to disappear. Instead Vincent pulled the chair beside him away from the table slightly. "Sit." One word. Calm. Absolute. My legs carried me forward before my brain caught up. The chair cushion felt softer than my entire mattress back home. I sat carefully at the edge, terrified of touching anything too expensive. Across the table, an older man with silver hair lowered his newspaper slowly. "Vincent," he said cautiously. "Who is this?" Vincent reached for the coffee pot without hurry. "Margaret Carter's daughter." "The housekeeper?" another man asked before stopping himself. Vincent poured coffee into my empty cup first before filling his own. The gesture felt so intimate and unexpected that I forgot how to breathe for a second. "Yes," he answered simply. Nobody spoke after that. The silence stretched long enough to become painful. I stared down at the polished silverware beside my plate, trying to remember which fork belonged to what. God, this was a mistake. I could already feel humiliation building inside my chest waiting to happen. Then Vincent reached toward the center tray and placed a warm croissant onto my plate himself. "Eat," he said quietly. I looked up at him in shock. You are not here to apologize today, Emily." Something about the way he said my name unraveled me a little inside. Soft enough to sound human. Firm enough to sound impossible to disobey. Across the table, the silver-haired man finally leaned back in his chair with narrowed eyes. "You canceled a council breakfast for this?" Vincent calmly buttered a piece of toast. "No. I canceled it because I discovered someone inside my home has been starving while the rest of us wasted food." Nobody answered him. Nobody dared. The staff moved carefully around the room pouring orange juice and replacing dishes while pretending not to stare directly at me. My pulse stayed painfully fast. I picked up the croissant with nervous fingers. It was still warm. Flaky butter melted against my tongue the second I took a bite, and suddenly I realized exactly how hungry I really was. Embarrassing tears burned behind my eyes before I could stop them. Vincent noticed immediately. Of course he did. Men like him noticed everything. But instead of commenting, he quietly slid the basket of pastries closer to me across the table. A small movement. Barely noticeable to anyone else. Somehow it felt bigger than every grand speech I had ever heard in my life. Then Vincent looked toward Diane for the first time that morning. His expression turned completely cold again. After breakfast, he said calmly, "You and I are going to discuss where the employee payroll has been disappearing for the past 3 years." The coffee cup slipped from Diane's hand and shattered across the marble floor. The sound of shattered porcelain echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Coffee spread across the white marble floor in dark waves while everyone at the table froze. Diane Holloway stared down at the broken cup near her feet as if she could somehow undo what had just happened. Vincent Moretti did not even blink. He calmly folded his napkin beside his untouched plate and looked toward one of the men standing near the doorway. Lucas, a tall man in a black suit, stepped forward immediately. "Yes, sir. Bring me every payroll report connected to estate operations for the past 3 years. Diane found her voice again. "Barely. Sir, there is no need to involve financial auditors over a misunderstanding." Vincent finally leaned back in his chair and looked directly at her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You seem nervous for someone innocent." Diane swallowed hard. "I have managed this estate faithfully for 11 years. Then you should have no problem explaining why a woman working 6 days a week cannot afford heart medication." Silence. Heavy. Suffocating silence. My mother stood near the service station with tears gathering in her eyes. I had never seen her look small before. Tired, yes. Stressed, always. But never small. Vincent noticed her expression immediately. "Margaret," he said more gently, "please sit down." My mother looked horrified. "Sir, I could never." That was not a suggestion. One of the staff members quickly pulled out a chair near the wall for her. The rest of the employees watched in stunned disbelief while my mother lowered herself into it carefully like she expected someone to stop her any second. I realized then that nobody in this house had probably told her to rest in years. Vincent turned toward Lucas again. "And contact Dr. Reynolds." Diane's face tightened. "The private physician?" "Yes." Vincent picked up his coffee cup calmly. "Margaret Carter should have had medical support months ago." My mother looked ready to cry openly now. "Mr. Moretti, that is too much. I cannot accept charity." Vincent's expression shifted slightly when he looked at her. Less cold. Almost tired underneath the power and control. "Taking care of people who spent years taking care of my home is not charity." Nobody knew what to say after that. The wealthy men around the table exchanged quiet glances over their breakfast plates while staff members pretended to focus on refilling water glasses. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Something invisible had cracked open inside the room. Vincent reached for a thin black folder Lucas had quietly placed beside him. He opened it slowly, scanning a few pages before speaking again. "Interesting." Diane's breathing visibly changed. "Over $400,000 in payroll discrepancies." My pulse stumbled. 400,000. Vincent flipped another page without hurry. Unauthorized deductions. False overtime reports. Missing employee benefits. His gray eyes lifted toward Diane again. "You stole from people who could barely afford groceries." "I can explain," Diane whispered. Vincent closed the folder softly. "I am sure you can." The calmness in his voice scared me more than anger would have. Because underneath it sat absolute certainty. Absolute control. Diane looked around the room desperately as if someone might defend her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Vincent nodded once toward Lucas. "You are relieved of your position effective immediately." Diane stared at him in disbelief. "You are firing me?" "No," Vincent corrected quietly. "I am removing someone who mistook cruelty for authority." The word settled deep in my chest. Cruelty for authority. I thought about every manager who had ever humiliated my mother for being poor. Every customer who snapped fingers at her like she was invisible. Every landlord who smiled politely while threatening eviction notices. Vincent stood from his chair slowly. The entire room straightened instinctively the moment he moved. Power followed him naturally, like gravity. But instead of walking away, he stopped beside my chair. His gaze lowered briefly toward the untouched fruit still sitting on my plate. "You barely ate." Embarrassment flushed through me again. I am not used to this much food. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Sadness maybe. Or guilt. That, he said quietly, is exactly the problem. By noon, the entire mansion felt different. Staff members who normally moved through the halls with their heads lowered now whispered quietly in corners every time Vincent passed. Some looked nervous. Others looked relieved. Diane Holloway's office remained locked while accountants in dark suits carried boxes of files downstairs under Lucas's supervision. Nobody explained anything directly, but everyone understood something important had happened. The illusion of fear inside the Moretti estate had cracked. I found my mother sitting alone in the employee garden behind the kitchen shortly after lunch. The tiny courtyard overlooked the Hudson River, though most workers were usually too exhausted to stop and enjoy the view. She held a paper cup of tea carefully between both hands like she was still trying to convince herself the morning had been real. "You should be resting," I said softly as I sat beside her. My mother smiled weakly. I do not remember the last time someone told me that. The sentence hurt more than I expected. For a few seconds we just sat there listening to the wind move through the hedges while sunlight reflected across the water beyond the stone wall. Then she looked at me carefully. "What happened between you and Mr. Moretti last night?" I stared down at my hands. "Nothing. Emily." I sighed quietly. "He found me in the kitchen." Her face immediately filled with heartbreak. Not anger. Worse. Shame. "Oh, sweetheart. Mom, please." My throat tightened instantly. "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I failed." Tears gathered in her eyes again. "You were never supposed to struggle this hard." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not because anything felt funny. Because exhaustion sometimes sounded like laughter. "I think everybody struggles now. Not like this." Her voice cracked. "You were studying all day and working all night while hiding overdue bills from me inside cereal boxes. You sold your father's watch for my medication." My chest froze. "How did you know that?" "Because I raised you." She reached over carefully, touching my hand. "And because I noticed when you stopped wearing it." I looked away quickly before the tears in my own eyes became obvious. That watch had been the last thing I owned from my father after he died. Selling it had felt like erasing another piece of him. But watching my mother skip medication because she could not afford refills felt worse. "I was handling it," I whispered. "No," she said gently. "You were drowning quietly." Before I could answer, footsteps approached across the stone path behind us. We both turned. Instinctively. Vincent Moretti walked into the courtyard without his jacket, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, his phone still in one hand. Lucas followed several feet behind before stopping near the entrance to give us privacy. Vincent's gaze moved briefly between me and my mother. "Dr. Reynolds is upstairs." My mother immediately started shaking her head. "Mr. Moretti, truly, this is unnecessary. Your test results disagree." Vincent's voice stayed calm, but there was no room inside it for argument. "You should have received treatment months ago." My mother looked stunned. "You already spoke to the doctor." "I spoke to 3 doctors." Vincent slipped his phone into his pocket. "1 cardiologist. 1 insurance attorney. 1 specialist at Mount Sinai." I blinked in disbelief. "Why?" The question came out before I could stop it. Vincent looked at me then. Really looked at me. The afternoon light softened the hard lines of his face just enough to make him seem less untouchable for a moment. Because no daughter should have to choose between college tuition and her mother's heartbeat. Silence settled over the garden again. Heavy. Emotional. My mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers. I could not speak at all. Vincent stepped closer slowly and placed a thin folder on the small iron table beside us. Your remaining tuition balance has been cleared, he said quietly. For the rest of the year. My heart stopped. What? You are returning to school full-time. Mr. Moretti, I cannot repay that. I did not offer it as a loan. I stared at the folder like it might disappear if I blinked. Nobody had ever helped me without wanting something in return afterward. Vincent seemed to notice the fear behind my silence because his expression changed slightly again. Softer now. Tired almost. Emily, he said quietly, being cared for should not feel frightening. The next morning felt unreal in the quietest possible way. I woke up expecting panic. Bills. Missed calls from creditors. Another double shift waiting at the diner. Instead I woke up inside the small guest suite Vincent had insisted my mother use while her medical tests continued at the estate. Soft. Blankets. Clean white curtains moving gently beside an open window. Silence that did not come from exhaustion for once. My mother was still asleep when I slipped downstairs around 7. The mansion smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bread again, but this time the scent did not make my stomach twist with hunger. It made me emotional instead. Like my body still did not trust that food could exist without fear attached to it. I wandered carefully toward the back kitchen and froze near the doorway. Vincent stood alone near the counter wearing dark gray slacks and a black sweater instead of his usual suits. Morning sunlight spilled across the marble behind him while steam rose from a cup of espresso in his hand. For a second he looked less like the man newspapers called dangerous and more like someone exhausted from carrying too much responsibility for too long. Then he noticed me immediately. Of course he did. You are awake early, he said. I glanced toward the wall clock. I usually start work by 6. Something unreadable crossed his expression again. That look he got every time I accidentally reminded him what my life had actually been like before this week. You do not work today. I know. The answer came out awkwardly because honestly, I did not know what to do with free time anymore. Vincent studied me over the rim of his espresso cup for a moment before speaking again. Hungry? The simple question hit harder than it should have. Nobody had asked me that gently before. Usually hunger was something people judged or ignored. I nodded once. Vincent walked toward the stove and lifted a lid from one of the pans warming there. Sit. I obeyed automatically, sliding onto one of the leather stools near the kitchen island. A few minutes later he placed a plate in front of me himself. Scrambled eggs. Toast. Fresh strawberries. Nothing fancy compared to the banquet meals upstairs. Somehow that made it feel more personal. More real. Thank you, I whispered. Vincent leaned against the counter across from me while I ate. Not watching in a controlling way. Watching carefully. Like he was making sure I actually allowed myself to finish the meal this time. Lucas found additional missing payroll accounts last night, he said quietly after a while. I swallowed slowly. Was it really that bad? Worse. His jaw tightened slightly. Some employees had portions of their health coverage removed without notice. Anger flickered briefly beneath his calm tone now. Controlled. Dangerous. People trusted this house to take care of them. I looked down at my plate. Most rich people do not notice workers enough to care. Vincent's eyes settled on me immediately. That is because most people confuse wealth with character. Silence stretched between us again, softer this time. Comfortable in a strange unfamiliar way. I realized then how different Vincent sounded when nobody else was around. Less cold. Less untouchable. Still powerful. But quieter underneath it. "Can I ask you something?" I said carefully. "You just did." I almost smiled despite myself. Vincent noticed. The corner of his mouth moved slightly too before disappearing again. "Why are you helping us?" The question lingered in the air between us. Vincent looked down into his espresso cup briefly before answering. "Because when I was 14, my mother cleaned hotel rooms 16 hours a day." I blinked in surprise. He rarely sounded personal. Vulnerable was probably not even a word people associated with Vincent Moretti. "We lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Queens," he continued quietly. "Some nights she pretended she was not hungry so I would eat more." My chest tightened painfully. Vincent finally looked back at me. "Poverty changes people, Emily. Not because it makes them weak. Because it teaches them survival before they are old enough to understand dignity." I stared at him in silence. Suddenly the way he noticed everything made sense. The exhaustion. The hidden shame. The instinct to apologize for existing. He recognized it because he had lived it too. Vincent stepped closer then and gently slid the fruit bowl nearer to me again. A small gesture. Soft. Human. "Eat," he said quietly. "You do not have to survive today." 3 days later, I stood outside my college building holding a backpack that suddenly felt too light. The Brooklyn air smelled like rain and traffic while students rushed past carrying coffees and laptops, laughing about exams and weekend plans like life had always been simple for them. I used to move through campus feeling invisible. Tired girl from the diner. Cheap shoes. Late tuition payments. Nobody looked twice. But today felt different somehow. Not because my clothes had changed. They had not. Not because my life was magically fixed overnight. It was not. The difference sat somewhere deeper. Quieter. Like my body no longer expected humiliation around every corner. I checked my phone while climbing the library steps. A new message from my mother waited on the screen. "Doctor says my heart is improving already. Stop worrying so much and go enjoy being 23 for once." I smiled before I could stop myself. A real smile this time. Not the exhausted kind people wear to survive customer service jobs. I had almost reached the entrance when someone called my name behind me. "Emily." I turned and froze. Kevin Harper stood near the bike racks holding 2 textbooks against his chest. My ex-boyfriend looked exactly the same as he had 6 months ago. Clean-cut blonde hair. Expensive sneakers. The kind of effortless confidence people develop when they have never worried about rent notices. "Wow," he said slowly. "You actually came back." My stomach tightened automatically. Not because I missed him. Because some people carried memories that made your nervous system brace before your brain caught up. Kevin glanced over my shoulder toward the black SUV parked across the street. 2 men in dark suits stood nearby talking quietly into earpieces. Lucas noticed me looking and gave a small respectful nod from beside the vehicle. Kevin noticed too. His eyebrows lifted. "Okay, what is that?" Heat crept into my face immediately. Vincent had insisted on security after discovering some former estate employees were threatening legal retaliation over the payroll investigation. I still was not used to being protected like this. "It is complicated," I muttered. Kevin laughed softly. "Emily Carter with security detail. That is new." I shifted uncomfortably. "What do you want, Kevin?" His expression changed. Slightly then. More serious. "Honestly, I wanted to apologize." That surprised me enough to silence me completely. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I heard about your mom getting sick last semester. His eyes dropped briefly. I should have helped more. I remembered all the nights I worked double shifts while he complained that I never had time for him anymore. All the times he called me dramatic for stressing over money. At the time I thought maybe exhaustion had made me difficult to love. Now I understood something different. Some people only know how to stand beside comfort. Vincent Moretti recognized struggle because he had survived it himself. You do not owe me anything, Kevin said quietly. I just did not realize how bad things were. Before I could answer, another car pulled smoothly beside the curb across the street. A dark gray Bentley. My heartbeat stumbled instantly. Vincent stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat over one of his perfectly tailored suits. Even from half a block away, people noticed him. Power followed Vincent naturally. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just absolute. Students slowed down instinctively watching him cross the sidewalk toward me. Kevin straightened awkwardly beside me. That your boyfriend? The question nearly made me choke. No, Vincent stopped directly in front of us, gray eyes settling on me first. You skipped lunch. I blinked in confusion. What? Lucas said you only bought coffee this morning. My face burned immediately. Kevin stared between us looking completely lost now. Vincent held out a small paper bag from a bakery near campus. Turkey sandwich. Fruit. Water. I accepted it slowly, still stunned. You drove all the way here because I forgot lunch? Vincent's expression stayed calm. No, his gaze softened almost invisibly. I came because someone once taught you that your needs were optional. The city noise around us faded for a second. Traffic. Voices. Wind moving between buildings. Everything blurred except the man standing in front of me holding lunch like it mattered more than business meetings or money or power. Kevin looked at me quietly after Vincent walked me toward the library. Entrance. Emily. I glanced back once. Yeah. He shook his head slowly with disbelief written all over his face. I do not think that man sees you the way other people do. Neither did I. Winter arrived quietly that year. The kind of New York cold that turned subway steam into ghosts drifting through the streets before sunrise. 3 months passed faster than I expected. My mother's health improved enough for her laugh to sound real again instead of exhausted. I returned to school full-time. The diner job disappeared from my life completely after Vincent somehow convinced me that sleeping more than 4 hours a night was not laziness. Some days still felt strange. I would walk through campus waiting for disaster to return because survival had trained my body to expect it. But slowly, piece by piece, life stopped feeling like something chasing me. And somehow, somewhere in the middle of all that healing, Vincent Moretti became the safest part of my week. Not because he bought expensive things. Honestly, he rarely did. It was smaller than that. Quieter. He remembered my exam dates without asking twice. Sent soup to my apartment when finals kept me awake all night. Called my mother every Sunday afternoon to check whether she was taking her medication correctly. Sometimes he would sit beside me in complete silence while I studied at the library and somehow the silence itself felt protective. Like my nervous system could finally rest near someone instead of staying alert all the time. The strangest part was watching the world react to him versus watching him when nobody important was around. Newspapers still called him intimidating. Powerful. Dangerous. Men in expensive suits still straightened the second he entered rooms. But I had seen him carrying grocery bags into my mother's apartment because she mentioned craving homemade pasta sauce from a small Italian store in Queens. I had watched him spend 40 minutes fixing the broken kitchen cabinet in her apartment because maintenance kept ignoring the request. Power looked different once kindness started living inside it. A week before Christmas, Vincent invited my mother and me to the estate for dinner. Snow covered the stone pathways outside the mansion while soft jazz music drifted through the dining room. Everything looked warm instead of intimidating for once. Real candles flickered against the windows. The staff laughed quietly in the kitchen. Nobody seemed afraid anymore. Halfway through dessert, Lucas entered carrying a stack of envelopes. "The final reimbursements arrived," he said. Vincent nodded once before looking toward the staff gathered nearby. "Every employee whose wages were stolen will receive full repayment before New Year's Day." A stunned silence spread across the room before someone quietly started crying near the kitchen doorway. Then another person hugged one of the servers beside them. My mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers again, just like she had months ago in the garden. Vincent noticed me watching him from across the table. "What?" he asked quietly. I shook my head slowly. "I just think you changed a lot of lives." Something softer crossed his expression then. Almost sad. "No," he said calmly. "I think people survive despite being failed too often." The room glowed around him in candlelight. Sharp gray eyes. Dark suit. A man powerful enough to own half the city sitting quietly at the end of a dinner table, making sure every employee in his home could finally breathe easier. I realized then that dignity was not always restored through grand speeches. Sometimes it happened through grocery bags. Through paid tuition balances. Through someone noticing you skipped lunch. Through a man looking at a terrified girl holding food from a trash bin and deciding her life mattered. Later that night, snowflakes drifted softly across the balcony outside the dining room while guests prepared to leave. I stood near the railing pulling my coat tighter against the cold when Vincent stepped beside me. Manhattan glittered behind him like gold scattered across black water. "You are thinking too hard again," he said quietly. I smiled faintly. "You always notice." "Only with you." My heartbeat stumbled softly at the answer. Vincent looked out across the city lights for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you know what I remember most about that night in the kitchen?" I shook my head. His eyes found mine slowly. "Not the leftovers." His voice stayed calm. Gentle. "I remember how quickly you apologized for being hungry." Emotion climbed into my throat so suddenly I could not answer. Vincent reached over then and adjusted my scarf slightly where the wind had loosened it. Such a small gesture. Careful. Protective. Human. "Nobody should learn shame before they learn safety, Emily," he said quietly. Snow drifted between us beneath the city lights while warmth spread painfully through my chest. And standing there beside the man the world feared, I finally understood something that changed me forever. He did not save me because I was weak. He saved me because somewhere along the way, the world had convinced me surviving quietly was all I deserved.